In ancient Egypt, priests were among the most revered members of society, tasked with maintaining the divine order, performing sacred rituals, and ensuring that the god's will was reflected in daily life. These men were considered intermediaries between mortals and deities, entrusted with immense spiritual and social authority. Their role was not merely ceremonial, they held power over the most intimate aspects of both religious practice and the lives of those who served in the temples. Temple virgins, often young women dedicated from childhood, were placed under the protection of these priests, intended to live a life of spiritual purity and devotion. They were symbols of divine favor, embodiments of sacred ideals, and vessels through which the gods could manifest their will. Yet, beneath the grandeur of ritual and devotion lay a sinister reality. The very authority that made priests revered also made them capable of terrible abuses. By twisting the sacred oaths they had taken, some priests betrayed the women under their care, exploiting the very trust that society had placed in them. These men had sworn to uphold the spiritual sanctity of the temple, to guide and protect the temple virgins, and to perform rituals without corruption. But historical accounts, including fragments of temple records, letters, and later chroniclers' narratives, suggest that this oath was violated repeatedly. Priests could manipulate the rigid hierarchies of the temple system. Knowing that the women had little recourse, they were both physically confined and socially bound, dependent on the priests for survival and spiritual approval. This betrayal took many forms. At times it was overt, involving coercion and sexual exploitation under the guise of ritual necessity. Priests could claim that certain rites demanded participation or purification from the temple virgins, framing abuse as a sacred duty. The notion of divine sanction created a climate in which the women themselves might internalize the acts as required, further eroding their ability to resist. The psychological manipulation was as devastating as the physical exploitation. To challenge a priest was to challenge the gods themselves, an act considered blasphemous and punishable both socially and spiritually. The societal structure of ancient Egypt facilitated this corruption. Temples were not just religious centers, they were economic and political powerhouses. Priests often controlled vast tracts of land, the labor of workers, and significant wealth. Their influence extended beyond the temple walls, reaching into the royal court and local governance. Temple virgins, by contrast, were largely isolated from broader society, their movements and interactions strictly regulated. This imbalance of power made it nearly impossible for the victims to escape, report, or resist. Even within the temple hierarchy, higher-ranking priests could protect or shield perpetrators from scrutiny, ensuring that abuses remained hidden under layers of secrecy and ritualistic authority. The corruption of sacred duties was also reflected in the rituals themselves. Many ceremonies involved intense secrecy, arcane language, and symbolic acts that outsiders could not easily interpret. Priests could use these rituals as a cover for illicit behavior. Historical texts suggest instances where virgins were compelled to participate in rites that involved nudity or intimate contact with the priests, under the pretext of spiritual cleansing or divine favor. The victims were often told that refusal would anger the gods, leading to misfortune for themselves, the temple, or even the entire community. This blending of religious duty and coercion created a profound moral and psychological trap. It is important to understand that not all priests were corrupt. Many genuinely dedicated themselves to the spiritual welfare of the temple and its inhabitants. Yet the actions of a few had devastating consequences, and the institutional structure often failed to protect the vulnerable. The betrayal of sacred duties was not merely an individual failing, it reflected a broader vulnerability in the system where power could be wielded without accountability, and divine authority could be misappropriated for personal gratification. The effects on the temple virgins were long-lasting. Beyond the immediate physical and emotional trauma, many suffered lifelong stigma and isolation. Some accounts suggest that victims who became pregnant or otherwise violated the temple's strict codes were ostracized, punished, or even sacrificed in extreme cases. Their suffering was compounded by the silence imposed upon them, a silence reinforced by societal reverence for the very men who had betrayed them. In this way, the priests' corruption not only violated personal trust, but also tainted the spiritual integrity of the temple, leaving a dark shadow over institutions meant to embody the divine. In retrospect, the twisted use of sacred duties highlights the dangers of absolute power without accountability. The priest's betrayal demonstrates how spiritual authority, when unchecked, can be weaponized to exploit the vulnerable. It also provides a stark reminder that institutions, no matter how sacred they appear, are composed of human beings capable of both reverence and cruelty. The duality of their roles as protectors and predators underscores the complexity of ancient Egyptian religious life, revealing a hidden, often horrifying dimension behind the grandeur of temples and ritual. Ultimately, the story of these abuses serves as both a cautionary tale and a historical lesson. It is a reminder that those entrusted with spiritual authority carry a responsibility that extends beyond ceremony. Their actions have profound consequences for those they claim to serve. In the case of the Egyptian priests who betrayed the temple virgins, the sacred was perverted, innocence was violated, and the very oaths meant to uphold the divine were twisted into instruments of oppression. Their legacy is a chilling testament to the human capacity for corruption. Under the guise of holiness in ancient Egypt, temple virgins held a position of both reverence and extreme vulnerability. Selected at a young age, often before adolescence, these girls were dedicated to the gods in a ritual that symbolized purity, obedience, and spiritual devotion. Their lives were meant to be a living embodiment of sacred ideals, untouched by the secular world and devoted entirely to the temple and its rituals. Yet behind the veneer of honor and sanctity lay a life of confinement, control, and often suffering, where innocence was tightly bound by chains, both literal and figurative. The selection process for temple virgins was highly ritualized and socially significant. Families offering a daughter to the temple often sought divine favor or recognition, believing that dedicating a child to sacred service would bring blessings, wealth, or protection. Once chosen, the girls were removed from ordinary life and introduced to the temple as initiates. Their days were regimented, filled with religious instruction, memorization of hymns, and training in ceremonial practices. They learned the sacred languages of prayer, the intricate movements of ritual dances, and the meticulous care of religious artifacts. On the surface, this life seemed noble, an existence devoted entirely to the gods, but the reality was far more complicated. The confinement within the temple walls was total. Temple virgins had limited contact with the outside world, restricted in movement and association. They lived under the authority of priests who supervised every aspect of their daily lives. The same men who were supposed to serve as spiritual guides and protectors also held ultimate power over them. Their routines were strict, leaving little room for personal choice or independence. Education, while rigorous, was designed not to empower but to ensure obedience and compliance within the temple's hierarchical structure. Deviations from the rules were harshly punished, sometimes with physical discipline or public humiliation, reinforcing a climate of fear. Beyond the strict control of their daily lives, the temple virgins were often subjected to a form of psychological manipulation that reinforced their dependence on the priests. They were taught from an early age that their value lay in purity, devotion, and obedience. Any perceived failure or disobedience could be framed as a moral or spiritual deficiency, fostering guilt and self-doubt. The priests exploited this conditioning, creating a sense of inevitability around their control. The girls were made to believe that the temple, and by extension the priests, was both their home and their authority, and that resistance was not only impossible but sinful. For many temple virgins, this life of isolation came with hidden dangers. Historical accounts and archaeological evidence suggest that some priests exploited the system for personal gain, using their authority to manipulate or abuse the very women they were supposed to protect. The isolation of the virgins, combined with the sanctity of the priestly office, meant that victims had few avenues for complaint or escape. Speaking out was not only dangerous, but could result in being ostracized or even expelled from the temple, a fate that carried social stigma and spiritual condemnation. In essence, the temple became both a sanctuary and a prison, a paradox in which devotion and danger were inseparably intertwined. The social invisibility of temple virgins extended beyond the temple walls. In Egyptian society, women's roles were already circumscribed, and the virgins' isolation magnified this effect. Once dedicated to the temple, they were largely erased from secular life. Their families could have limited contact with them, and their futures outside the temple were effectively closed. The world beyond the temple, which might have offered opportunities for marriage, trade, or personal freedom, was denied. Even within the temple, their existence was defined entirely in relation to the priests and the rituals, leaving little space for personal identity or autonomy. Yet, despite these constraints, temple virgins were often trained to exude an aura of dignity and grace. Their movements, speech, and bearing were carefully cultivated to reflect the ideals of purity and spiritual perfection. They performed dances, recited hymns, and participated in elaborate ceremonies, projecting an image of divine favor to the community. This public perfection masked a private reality of vulnerability and fear. The contrast between their outward poise and inward suffering underscores the tragic complexity of their lives. They were simultaneously honored and exploited, elevated in status yet bound by invisible chains. The psychological toll of such a life cannot be overstated. Temple virgins were caught in a system that demanded perfection but allowed no agency. Any mistake or lapse was seen not as a natural human failing, but as a spiritual failing, reinforcing feelings of inadequacy. Many likely experienced profound loneliness, anxiety, and a sense of powerlessness. For some, the awareness of abuse at the hands of priests, those charged with their protection, would have compounded the trauma, leaving invisible scars that endured for decades. Despite these hardships, temple virgins played an essential role in Egyptian religious life. Their presence was considered necessary for maintaining cosmic order, for performing rituals that connected the human and divine realms. They were revered symbols of purity and devotion, yet this reverence was conditional, dependent on their continued obedience and compliance. Their value lay not in their individuality but in their service, a paradox that highlights the intersection of spirituality and exploitation in the temple system. In retrospect, the lives of temple virgins offer a stark lesson about the fragility of innocence in hierarchical systems of power. Their devotion, innocence, and isolation made them simultaneously sacred and vulnerable. While temples were meant to be centers of divine protection and moral guidance, they could also become spaces of coercion and control. The juxtaposition of spiritual honor with personal subjugation paints a haunting portrait of life behind temple walls, one where sacred ideals were manipulated, innocence was constrained, and the price of devotion was often suffering. Ultimately, the story of the temple virgins is a reminder that reverence and power, when concentrated in a few hands, can be both protective and destructive. These young women were symbols of purity, yet their humanity was often subordinated to the demands of religious hierarchy. Their lives were defined by ritual, discipline, and obedience, yet shadowed by fear, exploitation, and limited autonomy. To understand their existence is to confront the complexities of ancient Egyptian society, where devotion and control were inseparably intertwined, and where the very institutions meant to uphold holiness could also betray. In ancient Egyptian temples, rituals were at the heart of religious life. They were elaborate, symbolic, and strictly controlled, performed to honor the gods, maintain cosmic order, and ensure the prosperity of the land. From sunrise prayers to seasonal ceremonies, the temple was a place of discipline, devotion, and awe. Yet, hidden behind the grandeur and pageantry of these sacred practices, there existed a darker, often unspoken reality. Some rituals, cloaked in secrecy, became instruments of exploitation, particularly for the temple virgins, whose lives were already tightly controlled. Behind closed doors, the very sanctity that should have protected them was manipulated to serve the desires and ambitions of certain priests. Many of these hidden rituals were highly esoteric, designed to be understood only by the initiated. The symbolism was intricate. Gestures, chants, and sequences of movement conveyed meanings that outsiders could not decipher. This secrecy, necessary for preserving the spiritual potency of the rites, also allowed for abuses to occur unnoticed. Priests could claim that certain practices required the presence or participation of virgins in intimate or compromising ways, framing acts of exploitation as sacred duties. The young women, conditioned to believe in the absolute authority of the priests and the inviolability of the rituals, were often unable to question or resist. What was presented as divine necessity became a tool for manipulation, blurring the line between piety and coercion. The structure of temple rituals inherently placed virgins in vulnerable positions. Many ceremonies required the women to be physically present in specific configurations, sometimes involving nudity, proximity to priests, or participation in acts described as purifications or spiritual cleansings. These rites were described in fragmentary temple texts as complex sequences with layers of symbolic meaning. But historical interpretations suggest that some priests used these moments to assert personal control. The ritual's supposed spiritual justification provided a veneer of legitimacy, shielding exploitative behavior from scrutiny by both the temple hierarchy and the broader society. Secrecy and hierarchy worked hand in hand to maintain this system of exploitation. Temples were structured with a rigid chain of command. High priests held ultimate authority, while lower-ranking priests and acolytes managed day-to-day operations. Temple virgins were subordinate to every level of this hierarchy, their lives carefully monitored and restricted. This made it nearly impossible for them to report abuses or seek protection. Even if a virgin attempted to appeal to a higher authority, the same structures that enforced ritual secrecy often protected the perpetrators. The priests' reputations, intertwined with religious authority, were considered sacrosanct, and any accusation risked not only the accuser's social standing, but her spiritual security. In this environment, the hidden rituals became mechanisms of control, ensuring obedience and silencing dissent. The psychological dimension of these rituals further deepened the exploitation. Temple virgins were taught to internalize the sanctity of the rites, believing that participation was necessary for the favor of the gods. Priests could frame abuse as a spiritual obligation, making the women complicit in their own victimization. This manipulation often involved elaborate instructions, sacred language, and symbolic gestures, creating the illusion of divine will. The combination of fear, reverence, and obligation created a powerful psychological trap. To resist was not merely disobedience, but perceived blasphemy. The women's innocence and devotion, meant to be protected by the rituals, were instead exploited to ensure compliance and submission. The abuses hidden within rituals were not always sexual in nature, though those forms were among the most damaging. Some priests exploited their authority to impose extreme labor, deprivation, or physical discipline under the guise of purification or training. Temple virgins could be required to fast for days, maintain rigorous postures, or perform exhausting ceremonial duties, all framed as spiritual exercises. Such practices reinforced dependence, obedience, and the perception that suffering was divinely ordained. Over time, these hidden rituals eroded personal autonomy, turning sacred practices into instruments of subjugation. Historical sources suggest that some of these abuses were tolerated or even endorsed by higher authorities within the temple system. The isolation of the virgins and the sanctity of ritual created a protective cover for perpetrators. Record-keeping in temples was selective, often emphasizing religious achievement while omitting uncomfortable details. Letters, decrees, and inscriptions hint at complaints or warnings, but they were vague, cryptic, or buried within ceremonial documentation. In this way, the very secrecy that preserved the divine mystery also concealed human wrongdoing. The hidden nature of these rituals had broader implications for the institution of the temple itself. While temples projected an image of moral and spiritual authority, the existence of exploitation behind the scenes revealed systemic vulnerabilities. Priests who misused their power undermined the sanctity of the rituals they performed, creating a tension between public perception and private reality. The exploitation of temple virgins, sacred symbols of purity, was particularly corrosive as it tainted the very ideals the temple sought to uphold. Bold. Yet the combination of social reverence, ritual secrecy, and hierarchical authority meant that these abuses could persist for generations with minimal accountability. The lives of the virgins who endured these hidden rituals were marked by trauma and silence. Many internalized the shame, believing that participation in these acts, even when coerced, was a personal failing. Others struggled with long-term psychological effects, including anxiety, fear, and a distorted sense of self-worth. Their suffering, largely invisible to the outside world, highlights the human cost of religious and institutional power wielded without checks or oversight. For the community, the exploitation remained unseen, shielded by the aura of sanctity and the prestige of the priesthood. Despite the darkness behind these hidden rituals, it is essential to remember that not all aspects of temple life were corrupt. Many priests and temple officials genuinely devoted themselves to spiritual guidance, education, and the care of virgins. Temples were also centers of learning, art, and community support, providing a framework for cultural and religious life. The problem arose when the combination of secrecy, authority, and vulnerability intersected, creating conditions in which exploitation could occur. The hidden rituals, intended as conduits to the divine, became a tool of manipulation and abuse, demonstrating the dangers inherent in unaccountable power. In retrospect, the hidden rituals of Egyptian temples offer a haunting window into the intersection of religion, power, and vulnerability. They reveal how sacred practices, designed to inspire devotion and maintain cosmic order, could be twisted into mechanisms of control and abuse. Temple virgins, isolated and dependent, were trapped in a system that promised spiritual honor while exposing them to exploitation. Behind the closed doors of our ritual chambers, the line between sacred duty and personal violation was blurred, leaving a legacy of trauma that history has only partially recovered. Ultimately, the story of these hidden rituals serves as a cautionary tale about the human capacity to misuse authority under the guise of sanctity. It reminds us that the most revered institutions are not immune to corruption, and that the safety and dignity of the vulnerable depend on accountability and vigilance. For the temple virgins, the rituals that should have protected their innocence instead bound it, creating a world where devotion and fear, honor and suffering, were inseparably intertwined. In ancient Egyptian temples, the lives of the vulnerable, particularly the temple virgins, were controlled not only by ritual and hierarchy, but also by a pervasive system of fear. This fear was deliberate, meticulously maintained, and inseparable from the very structures designed to protect the sanctity of the temple. Behind the grandeur of sacred architecture and the ceremonial splendor, a network of social, spiritual, institutional mechanisms ensured that those who exploited their authority could do so with near total impunity. Silence was not merely a byproduct of this system, It was its foundation. The temple was an environment of extreme hierarchy. High priests wielded power over both subordinates and initiates, commanding obedience that extended to every aspect of daily life. Within this rigid structure, questioning authority was inconceivable. The priest's authority was not only social but deeply spiritual. They were intermediaries between mortals and gods, and their word was considered a reflection of divine will. For temple virgins, disobedience or complaint was framed not merely as rebellion against human authority, but as a transgression against the gods themselves. The consequences of speaking out, therefore, would be both temporal and spiritual, creating an environment in which silence became a survival strategy. Fear in the temple operated on multiple levels. At the most basic, it was physical, strict discipline, punishment for mistakes, and the threat of expulsion reinforced obedience. Temple virgins who failed to perform rituals correctly, disobeyed instructions, or attempted to resist coercion faced humiliation, deprivation, or physical discipline. These punishments were framed as corrective or even sacred, further complicating the victim's understanding of justice. Beyond immediate consequences, there were psychological threats. Priests could manipulate beliefs about divine wrath, telling the virgins that their suffering, the misfortune of the temple, or even disasters in the wider community could result from disobedience. In this way, fear was internalized, becoming a tool of self-regulation. The social dimension of this fear was equally powerful. The temple virgins were isolated from their families and the broader community, leaving them dependent entirely on the priests for survival, sustenance, and spiritual guidance. Any attempt to appeal to the outside world risked being dismissed or punished, as outsiders often deferred to the priesthood's authority. This isolation reinforced a sense of helplessness. There was no safety net, no advocate, and no alternative. Even peers within the temple, also bound by fear and hierarchy, were unlikely to intervene, either out of self-preservation or conditioned obedience. The system thus created a collective silence, in which the abuser's power went unchallenged. Institutional mechanisms further protected the abusers. Temples were centers of political and economic power. Priests managed land, labor, and wealth, giving them influence far beyond religious duties. High-ranking priests could manipulate records, reinterpret ritual requirements, or suppress complaints, ensuring that allegations of abuse rarely reached those with the power to intervene. Temple administration emphasized continuity and reputation. The integrity of rituals, the authority of the priesthood, and the public image of sanctity were prioritized over individual welfare. In practice, this meant that protecting abusers was institutionalized, embedded in the very rules and culture of the temple. The religious framing of authority was central to sustaining silence. Priests could justify coercion by invoking divine will, claiming that their actions were necessary for the favor of the gods or the maintenance of cosmic order. This argument was potent because temple virgins were raised to believe in the absolute authority of the priests and the spiritual importance of their duties. Any resistance could be interpreted as sacrilege, creating a moral and spiritual barrier to speaking out. Fear of divine retribution thus became intertwined with fear of human punishment, reinforcing obedience through internalized guilt and terror. Gender dynamics compounded the problem. Temple virgins were young women, often without independent social power or economic resources. In contrast, the priests were adult men with authority sanctioned by both society and religion. The imbalance of power was stark, making coercion both feasible and difficult to challenge. Female initiates were often trained from a young age to accept obedience as a virtue and to value spiritual duty over personal autonomy. This conditioning, combined with physical and social confinement, ensured that fear and silence were deeply ingrained in their daily existence. Moreover, the secrecy surrounding temple practices helped conceal abuses. Many rituals were intentionally hidden from the public, understood only by the initiated. This secrecy meant that even if a temple virgin's seed confided in someone outside the immediate hierarchy, the account would be incomprehensible or dismissed. Priests could claim that certain actions, no matter how objectionable, were essential to sacred rites. The combination of secrecy, hierarchy, and spiritual authority made resistance nearly impossible and allowed abusers to operate with impunity. The consequences of this system were devastating. For temple virgins, the internalization of fear and the necessity of silence created long-term psychological trauma. Victims often experienced anxiety, depression, and a distorted sense of self-worth. The very environment meant to cultivate spiritual growth instead fostered submission and fear. Many virgins carried the burden of their experiences in silence, unable to reconcile the abuse with the sacred ideals they had been taught to uphold. The fear-induced compliance ensured that abusers rarely faced accountability, perpetuating cycles of exploitation across generations. Even after leaving the temple, many victims were haunted by the experience. Social stigma could follow those who were expelled or compromised within the temple system. Their reputations, tied to notions of purity and obedience, were fragile, and any deviation, real or perceived, could lead to marginalization. In this way, the system of fear extended beyond the temple walls, shaping not only the immediate experiences of the virgins, but also their long-term social and psychological realities. Ultimately, the system that protected abusers in Egyptian temples reveals a chilling interplay of power, religion, and fear. Silence was not simply a personal choice. It was enforced by physical authority, social isolation, spiritual manipulation, and institutional complicity. The very structures designed to maintain holiness and order were, in some cases, turned into mechanisms of control and exploitation. By understand this dynamic, we gain insight into the profound vulnerabilities of those placed in dependent positions within hierarchical institutions, as well as the human cost when reverence is weaponized. The story of the temple virgins and the system of fear that surrounded them serves as a sobering reminder of the dangers inherent in unchecked authority. Even in institutions designed to uphold virtue and sanctity, the concentration of power, secrecy, and social deference can create conditions in which abuse thrives. The priest's betrayal, shielded by fear and silence, left lasting scars on those they were meant to protect, and the lessons of these abuses resonate far beyond the walls of ancient temples. In the end, the system of fear that protected abusers was as insidious and destructive as the acts themselves, turning sacred institutions into cages for the innocent. The abuses committed against temple virgins in ancient Egypt left a scar not only on the victims themselves, but on the historical memory of the institutions and individuals involved. While temples were intended as centers of spiritual guidance, cultural preservation, and societal order, the dark realities behind their walls could not be fully erased. The legacies of these crimes, though often obscured by centuries of myth, ritual glorification, and selective record-keeping, continue to offer insights into both the vulnerabilities of the vulnerable and the moral failings of those in positions of absolute authority. Much of the historical record regarding temple abuses is fragmented. Ancient Egyptian documentation was not created with the intention of preserving the experiences of those exploited within religious institutions. Rather, it focused on glorifying the gods, commemorating rulers, and highlighting the sanctity of temple rituals. As a result, direct accounts of abuse are rare, often hinted at in oblique. References are discovered through careful interpretation of texts, inscriptions, and later commentary by historians and chroniclers. This scarcity, however, does not diminish the gravity of what occurred. Instead, it underscores how the power structures of the time were designed to erase or conceal evidence of wrongdoing. Archaeological findings provide additional, though indirect, evidence of the abuses experienced by temple virgins. Certain temple layouts, private chambers, and isolated quarters reveal the controlled and restricted environments in which these women lived. Artifacts such as ritual implements, ceremonial clothing, and religious paraphernalia can be analyzed to suggest the kinds of practices in which the virgins participated, and, by extension, the ways in which these sacred practices may have been manipulated by priests for personal gain. Scholars studying these findings have pointed out that the combination of ritual secrecy, hierarchical authority, and gendered vulnerability created a structural environment in which abuse could flourish, often hidden from the eyes of society. The moral and cultural impact of these abuses extended beyond the immediate temple environment. Temple virgins, though revered in public ceremonies, were often silenced in life, their suffering invisible. When abuses were acknowledged, they were frequently reframed to protect the reputation of the priests and the sanctity of the rituals. Victims, if mentioned at all, were portrayed as either passive participants in divine service or as morally compromised individuals, obscuring the reality of coercion and exploitation. This historical erasure reinforced a narrative in which the power of the temple and its clergy remained unquestioned, even as the lives of the vulnerable were deeply harmed. Later historians, both ancient and modern, have grappled with these legacies. Some ansi. NT chroniclers alluded to corruption within temples, highlighting instances in which priests abused their authority or failed to live up to spiritual ideals. However, these accounts often emphasized moral lessons or political criticism rather than the human suffering of the virgins themselves. Modern scholarship has sought to reconstruct these experiences with greater sensitivity, using archaeological evidence, linguistic analysis, and comparative study of temple hierarchies to illuminate the lived realities of the women who endured exploitation. Through this lens, the abuses are not only acts of individual malfeasance, but symptoms of systemic failure, embedded within religious, social, and economic structures. The psychological and social legacies for the victims themselves were profound. Temple virgins, who survived the abuses, often carried trauma that shaped their entire lives. Isolation, fear, and coerced participation in rituals left lasting emotional scars. Many were stigmatized if they were perceived to have violated temple codes, regardless of coercion, creating a double burden of trauma and social marginalization. Even centuries later, these patterns offer insight into how institutions of power can exploit trust, suppress agency, and perpetuate cycles of harm. The broader historical implications are equally significant. The narrative of abuse within temples challenges romanticized visions of ancient Egyptian religion as purely noble or spiritually enlightened. It reminds us that sacred authority, when unchecked, can be as destructive as it is revered. The stories of temple virgins, their exploitation, and the protection of abusers highlight the human cost of institutional power. A cost that resonates in other historical and cultural contexts where hierarchy and secrecy shield wrongdoing. Despite the suppression of their voices in life, the experiences of temple virgins have survived in subtle ways, leaving traces in cultural memory. Literary texts, later religious commentaries, and modern historical studies provide glimpses into the complexities of temple life. These sources reveal the paradox. At the heart of the legacy, temples were simultaneously sites of profound spiritual achievement and spaces where innocence could be violated under the guise of holiness. This duality forces historians and readers alike to confront uncomfortable truths about the ways in which authority can be misused and the fragility of those who are placed in positions of dependence. The ethical lessons from these legacies are timeless. They underscore the necessity of accountability, transparency, and protection for vulnerable populations within any institution, sacred or secular. They also highlight the importance of preserving and interpreting historical evidence with an eye toward the experiences of those who were silenced. By reconstructing the hidden narratives of temple virgins, scholars and readers gain not only a clearer understanding of the past, but a moral framework for considering power, trust, and exploitation in the present. Furthermore, the memory of these abuses challenges the ways in which societies remember sacred institutions. While temples continue to be admired for their architectural beauty, religious significance, and cultural contributions, their history is not unblemished. The legacies of horror left by corrupted rituals and abused virgins complicate the narrative, compelling a more nuanced understanding of the intersection between spirituality and human frailty. Recognizing this duality does not diminish the achievements of ancient Egypt, but instead situates them within the full spectrum of human experience, acknowledging both inspiration and transgar. Ultimately, the crimes committed against temple virgins and the systems that protected the perpetrators have left an enduring mark on history. They serve as a chilling reminder that power without accountability, reverence without oversight, and hierarchy without justice can lead to profound human suffering. The legacies of horror are preserved not only in archaeological evidence or fragmented texts, but also in the ethical questions they raise about the use and abuse of authority. For the temple virgins, history may have muted their voices, but the traces of their experiences endure, challenging us to confront the consequences of exploitation and to honor the humanity of those who suffered in silence. By remembering these hidden abuses, we do more than study the past. We confront the mechanisms of oppression that can exist anywhere trust is weaponized and authority unchecked. The legacy of horror is a call to vigilance, empathy, and justice, an insistence that sacred institutions or any centers of power must be accountable to those they claim to serve. Through this understanding, the stories of temple virgins, though born of suffering, continue to resonate, demanding recognition, reflection, and moral responsibility from each generation that studies them.